There's a billion people, roughly, in the industrialized world. 1% of that is 10 million people. Now, suppose that each of those people came up with $1,000. That would be $10 billion. $10 billion is enough to, from my point of view, do a very extensive colonization program. Of course, that's based on doing things a very different way from the sort of NASA model, but I honestly believe that we are in a world situation now where ways of doing things are changing. You know, for a long time, big programs have either been done by the government or by large joint stock companies. Of course, both of these have the characteristic they leverage small contributions from a large number of people. We are entering an age now where it's much easier than it has been for a long time to do that in other ways. I mean, obviously things like Kickstarter projects for $1 million are something real now, and that's kind of amazing. And of course we look at the fact that there are a number of people who have tens of millions of dollars to spend, who have chosen to spend that on some kind of space activity, not all working in the same direction, obviously, but have chosen to spend that on some kind of space activity. And it seems to me that when there's a cultural feeling that this is something that you can talk about without getting laughed at, then people are going to, you know, they're going to tell their friends and neighbors. They're going to say, you know what, I put $10 into a trust fund which is going to send somebody to the moon, or something of this nature. People will be willing to not only do things, but tell other people that they're doing them. And of course, the more people who do something, it's a typical social aspect, the more people get involved in it. You know, it's a critical mass problem. And that's what we've been facing for a long time. Those of us who care about these kinds of issues, A, have not been good at reaching out to each other and coordinating with each other, and B, have been depending on people who don't care, people in Congress, people on Wall Street, to actually do the things we want done. And I'm sorry, but you're never going to get any results waiting for somebody who doesn't care about your issue to do something about it.
With all of that being said, what can we inside of the space community start to do in our own individual ways to be able to move projects forward and to be able to get support and be able to get more people involved and have that snowball effect?
I think there are two very important things, and one of them is to, as I've said before, reach out to people you wouldn't ordinarily think of. A lot of people who come to the Space Access Conference are not necessarily people from the aerospace world. I mean, I think of Michael Clive, if it's okay to mention people by name. You know, he was a graphic artist in the film industry 4 years ago, and he got involved with local makerspace, started playing around with rocket engines, came out to a couple of these conferences, and is now working for SpaceX as a propulsion systems engineer. So the fact is that he's gone from being a total outsider from the point of view of people whose idea of space is coterminous with the membership of the AIAA to being an insider. Now, if that kind of thing can happen, it just shows that there are a lot of people out there you need to reach out to. And instead of saying, you know, and of course that means a change in attitude also, because a lot of people inside the aerospace community particularly have been accustomed to sort of the NASA and military contractor model of doing things, and they're resistant to unfamiliar ways of doing things. And the NewSpace community doesn't have quite that problem, but we still tend to have a problem with talking to people who don't already know what we're talking about. And so one of the things I do, for example, is I hand out copies of books. Books like The Green Hills of Earth by Robert Heinlein, books like Colonies in Space by Heppenheimer, fiction and nonfiction, but books which expand people's understanding, we expand people's minds, get them starting to think about humanity not just as a phenomenon on the surface of the Earth, but as a cosmic phenomenon. You know, every time I hear somebody saying, oh, well, you know, we're facing, you know, population catastrophe or one thing or another, you know, I like to stop and point out, you're assuming that the world, for purposes of reference, the only things that matter now or will ever matter to humanity is basically a slice 1 mile above and below the habitable, accessible land surface area of the planet Earth, which is balderdash. It's absurd. Even now, Even now, that's not true, given the economic effects of weather satellites and communication satellites, for example. You look at what Hurricane Ike did to Houston. It was basically a repeat of the 1900 Galveston hurricane, but with satellite weather imagery. We evacuated the city ahead of time. Property damage would have been greater. Loss of life would probably be in the hundreds of thousands, if not for satellite weather maps. That's a huge effect. And nobody talks about it. But it just goes to show you how much this really does matter in ways that people are not talking about at all. And so, yeah, every one of us, I think, in the space community owes it to himself or herself. One of the things about Lunacy is that all the people who appear in the film basically are male. And I think that's really unfortunate because it gives the impression that everyone in the space community is a man. And it simply isn't true. I mean, the NSS secretary right now, Anita Gale, for example, long-time Boeing engineer working with NASA, that kind of thing. What I've found is, however, that many of the women in the NSS and in such like in the AIAA also tend to be quietly doing important things, and they can't be bothered to show up for TV interviews. But every one of us in the space community owes it to himself to inject that into the public debate so that it's not just a case of, oh, you should talk to your congressman and tell them that they should provide more money for NASA because, NASA does cool things. No. You need to just drop hints every now and then about what things are important and why they're important. I really think that that is one of the biggest things that any of us can do, is simply bring space issues into that social conversation. Anytime you hear somebody talking about one of these issues, energy shortage, for example, you can talk about space solar power. It's not forbidden. You can talk about it. Anytime people talk about resource depletion, you can talk about asteroid mining. When I talk about asteroid mining, I always tell people, people talk about asteroid mining as though it were something new. It's not. We've been doing it for thousands of years. Probably the very first iron worked by human beings was meteoric iron. All the nickel in the coins in your pocket came from a meteor crater. For example, Sudbury Astrobleem up in Ontario. All the platinum that you see around you comes from meteor craters. The Vredefort Formation of South Africa, for example, giant eroded crater, hundreds of millions of years old. Bring people to understand these are not screwy ideas, and they're not new ideas. It's just a question of, we've been waiting for the solar energy and the meteoric metals to come to us for so long. Why don't we go out there and get some for ourselves for a change? And in the same way, I like to talk about O'Neill colonies. They're marvelous, and they're easy to talk to people about. You say, well, you realize most parts of the Earth are not very friendly to human beings. And of course, people talk about terraforming Mars, but it's much smaller, and no matter what you do to it, it's never going to be much more pleasant than the Earth, right? But Gerard O'Neill, back in the 1960s and 70s, started talking about this concept where you construct these, like space stations, but enormous, these enclosed pressurized shells, and you can tailor the interior environment. So if you want something the size of North America with the climate of San Diego, you can do that. And, gosh, that would definitely take the pressure off of California real estate prices. So, from my point of view, that's what we need to do most, is to begin injecting these ideas into the public conversation so that people who have never thought about this before, who've never heard of it before, have an easier time understanding that this is not a pipe dream, and it's not something that requires the resources of a major national government or any of this other shibboleths that get passed around about why we can't do big things in space. Oh, it's too hard. That no, this is something that can be done. This is something that should be done. And if enough of us are willing, it's something that will be done. And if we're not willing, then it won't. In other words, if we don't have a colony on the moon today, and apparently we don't, we have only ourselves to blame because we've been piss-poor advocates for the single most important thing to happen since life moved onto land.
You're absolutely right about that.
And
literacy plays into that advocacy.
And I took up, I agreed to appear in Lunacy in the first place precisely because it would give me a wider stage for my advocacy efforts. I always say advocacy is the first step. I get involved with a lot of other things. I mean, frankly, I'm bad at it. I'm not photogenic. I'm not an interesting person to be around, but I will hector people for hours without ceasing on issues if I think they're important enough. And so, you know, having that whatever degree of bully pulpit you get from being in a movie these days, where, you know, thousands, if not millions of people will, you know, eventually see, even if it, you know, comes up in their Netflix queue, you might also be interested in lunacy. You know, that becomes some place that I can say, you know, this is important. And they see the things that I say, you know, and they see the business in San Antonio, for example, of course, very truncated. It took about a 15-minute speech, well, 10 to 15 minutes, and then truncated it down to about 3 minutes. And so there's a lot of stuff that I say that I thought was actually sort of better lines than made it into the film, but they didn't work out of context. And that is, to me, that's the important thing about the film. Obviously, for other people, it'll be other things. And hopefully people will find it entertaining, causing them to recommend it to their friends, because there's nothing more boring than having a film recommended to you for an issue. I mean, I'm sorry. There are lots of issue documentaries out there, and the only ones that people remember at all after the fact are the ones that are worth watching for themselves. And I do think lunacy succeeds in that.